I don't know what you were doing during Reagan's first term as president, but I was playing in punk rock bands and plotting my escape from an extremely small town in western Massachusetts. No one would have mistaken me for an actual musician, but back then, being earnest, or better yet, sincerely angry, was more important than talent training or actually having all 6 of your strings on your guitar at any one time. And I had anger to spare. Punk rock back then wasn't something you could decide to just be and then go to the mall the next day and buy the kit. It wasn't cool and it wasn't a pose. Not yet. Punk rock was an island that all the weirdos and misfits washed up on together. We weren't doing it to be different. We needed it for 1,000 different reasons. My reasons centered on a monumentally sad and sometimes dangerous home life and a gnawing dread that, as bad as things seemed, all I had to look forward to was more of the same or worse. Or instant atomic annihilation. Back before the internet, promoting your band was impossible. You could pack the local VFW hall with all of your punk rock friends if you'd offered free beer and a $3 cover. But if you traveled 5 miles in any direction, no one had ever heard of you. Now, the holy grail in those days was landing what we called a college gig that would get you playing in front of actual strangers. And through some miracle, my band at the time landed a gig at a private college that was world-renowned. What it was world-renowned for, I'll get to in a second. But you can imagine how thrilled we were. The college was in Washington, D.C., an actual city that even then had an actual punk scene. Maybe Rollins would show up. How awesome would that be? The weeks leading up to this gig were spent working the good news into every possible conversation. So you're going to Canada for your vacation. Ever been to Washington, D.C.? My band has a gig there. You like sandwiches? Boy, me too. You know, I hope they have sandwiches in Washington, D.C. My band has a gig there. Oh, I didn't know your mom died. Say, did she ever get to Washington, D.C.? You get the idea. I was insufferable. Now, while we prepared for this epic adventure, additional information slowly started to trickle in because, you know, back before the internet, you made your plans and lived your life based more on theory and conjecture than on actual data and information. So it turned out we would be sharing the bill with an on-campus band. Okay. You know, they might even be thrilled, because we had told the organizers of this gig that we were a Boston band, even though we were actually from a farm town about 100 miles from Fenway Park. Oh, turns out we're actually opening for the on-campus band. Well, that's okay, I think. And finally, less than a week before the gig, the last shoe dropped. We learned that the world-renowned college we would be playing at was world-renowned for being a college for the deaf. Now, we didn't let this news or the ceaseless ridicule of our friends and family bother us. See, it's easy to remain undaunted when you really have no idea what you're doing. So we packed up our gear and headed south towards Washington and the unknown. The deaf unknown. Now, when we finally arrived at the campus, the guards had no idea who we were or why we were there. They had never heard of our contact person, and they knew nothing about a punk rock show scheduled for that night. This was all oddly reassuring. Everything was proceeding just like every other gig we'd ever had. We wandered around the campus figuring we would just ask somebody where the show was. Ask somebody. We might as well have been in Tokyo or Berlin because everyone we saw was hearing impaired and none of us spoke deaf. But we finally found two dudes who, although they were deaf, were clearly in our tribe, as evidenced by their bad haircuts, too many belts, and the vaguely yet haunted, smug look of the self-imposed outsider. They led us to the building where the gig was supposed to be, which we found to be locked up tight, with no one in sight who knew anything about a punk rock show. Things were finally back on track. Eventually, someone showed up with the right keys, and we loaded our gear into a small room with an even smaller stage. The two deaf punks scurried around, setting up kegs and putting away anything breakable. We still hadn't met the band we were going to be opening for, but their huge, obnoxious stacks of equipment already covered 95% of the stage, which really pissed us off. So we shoved some of it aside, made room for our gear, plugged in for sound check, and started yelling "check 1, 2" into the mics, like we'd seen bands do. Then we started playing some chords, and pretty soon the sound guy came out from behind the soundboard, shaking his head in that infuriating way sound guys always do. But instead of telling us to turn down, he said, "Guys, you're gonna have to play a lot louder than that." Louder? No one ever asked us to play louder. Everyone's deaf, he said. Then he shrugged his shoulders in the universal sign for duh. So we cranked up our amps, and I watched as the sound guy pushed every lever on the board all the way up to the top. He still looked dubious, but it sounded pretty goddamn loud to me. And loud always equals good. So the crowd, the people started arriving, and beer started to flow. A cassette of punk rock songs blasted through the PA. Loud. But no one was shouting to be heard over the music. They were all signing at each other and drinking beer like maniacs. 4 dozen deaf kids getting drunk like it was a contest. So at least we all had that in common. Now the other band finally arrived, and while we all tried to be friendly, there was still that automatic competitive vibe between bands. They couldn't hear or speak, but their smirks spoke volumes. It said this was their place and their crowd. But our steely-eyed slow nods told them that we were still going to blow them off the stage, like any Boston band would. The lights flickered 3 times, and the already drunk crowd got in position in front of the stage, and nothing happened. No one introduced us. We didn't know what the hell to do. So we just ran on stage, strapped on our gear, and there was silence. And we looked out, and everyone was just doing this. Now we know now, this is how a deaf audience applauds. But we didn't know it then. It scared the shit out of me. This silent sea of waving hands. We looked at each other and just gathered our collective strength and just started. We didn't know what else to do. We launched into our set, which consisted of poorly executed Ramones covers and original songs that were actually the same Ramones songs, but with our own lyrics over the top. And we were playing louder than we had ever played before. It should have been awesome. It should have been. But we just weren't getting through to them. There was no energy. There was no crowd response. There was no moment of punk rock jump-off. Now, the deaf may applaud in a unique way, but they boo in a much more universal fashion. And of course, they soon started throwing stuff at us. But just before it got irredeemably out of hand, the guys in the other band, the guys we were sure were jerks, ran out on stage, turned on all their equipment, and then plugged our guitars into their gear. When our bass player started to play again, it felt like someone was hitting me in the back with an axe handle. The first chord I hit was so goddamn loud, my vision actually got blurry. And when any of us even whispered into a microphone, it sounded like bombs were going off. The crowd finally went nuts. A swirling mosh pit instantly formed right in front of me, and everyone joined in the apocalyptic mayhem. Punk rock jump off. Now, ironically, everything was so loud that on stage, we actually couldn't hear anything. Just this constant roar that sounded and felt like we were standing inside of a jet engine that was inside of another jet engine. I mostly just counted to 4 in my head and then changed chords whenever I felt through the soles of my Doc Martens the beat come back around to the 1. Now from the stage I could see people feeling the music, and I watched their body react to it. They weren't dancing. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. They were letting the pressure waves push their bodies around like they were chest deep in a changing tide. It actually was amazing. And we played nonstop for an hour, which is quite a trick when you only know 9 songs, and they're all only 2 minutes long. But we pulled it off, and when we finished, we got the hands, and it was awesome. Now, when we finally packed up and left, we couldn't get over how differently everything felt after a good gig, since none of us had ever had a good gig. It was like the whole world had slowed down. We were all speechless, and we were just grinning and nodding at each other. And the car even seemed to run smoother. And we couldn't get over what a peaceful and quiet city Washington, D.C. was late on a Saturday night at the height of the crack epidemic. Then we were shocked out of our reverie when suddenly and without warning, 4 police cars appeared out of nowhere and shot past us with all their lights blazing, and they were in a big hurry. But we didn't hear any of their sirens. And that seemed pretty odd. And that's when we realized we were all totally deaf.